taking a deep dive into the themes that children represent in Persepolis and Pan's Labyrinth. How are themes represented in different movies? Sometimes we have objects representing a prominent theme in a movie. Sometimes we have lines of dialogue. In this case, we have people, or more specifically, children. Because members of the younger age are inherently associated with disobedience and the innocence of hope by nature, this allowed directors Guillermo del Toro and Margie Satrapi to not only utilize this association to represent these themes, but also leads into the overall theme of coming of age in Pan's Labyrinth and Persepolis through historical and social context. Other than these two main themes, we have multiple themes that children manifest in both of these films. We have choice, self-empowerment, freedom, rebellion, creating one's own opportunities, breaking the rules for the better, and even femininity and growing up. There are two themes that seem to play a more prominent role in both films than the others, which, as mentioned earlier, are the innocence of hope and disobedience. Furthermore, there are themes that are more prominent in one film than the other, and vice versa as well. In Pan's Labyrinth, the theme of creating your own opportunities is prominent, whereas in Persepolis, Margie represents the theme of forgiveness more. In Pan's Labyrinth, we see a visual representation of Ophelia creating her own opportunities when she uses the chalk to make a door, solving her problem by using her imagination and creativity. In Persepolis, we see Margie being taught the importance of forgiveness after she tries to take justice into her hands at school. All of these themes previously mentioned are themes that the children themselves represent in both of these films, and these themes would not be as prominent or present at all without the children's inherent nature. Moving on to what are the two biggest themes the children represent, we see the representation of hope and disobedience. Despite being portrayed in a very different light throughout both films use children to represent these major concepts. Children are symbols of innocent hope for the future and faith in both films, as they represent trusting in something so far-fetched and unpopular just because they want to. Their coming of age and loss of innocence is different in both films based on the social context of the films, but nonetheless prominent. First off, portraying hope and disobedience from a children's perspective is the Pan's Labyrinth scene where Ophelia is checking on the mandrake under her mother's bed and is confronted by Captain Vidal. Take a look.
Haciendo mayor y pronto entenderás que la vida no es como en tus cuentos de hadas. El mundo es un lugar cruel y eso vas a aprenderlo, aunque te duela. ¡Ofelia! La magia no existe. No existe ni para ti, ni para mí, ni para nadie.
As we see here, when Ophelia's hope and belief in magic is snatched away from her by the hurtful words of Vidal and her mother, everything starts deteriorating. This scene is a perfect visual representation of how children represent hope. As Jennifer Orme says in Narrative Desire and Disobedience in Pan's Labyrinth, the film endorses stories of magical transformation as forms of resistance and vehicles of hope. This is especially during that time with a fascist nation, an abusive stepfather, and her mother dying. Hope is the only thing that lets her see past the horrors of the world. Her hope and belief in magic lets her escape from her stepfather and heal her mother, until unfortunately she passes away. With the hope that she represents in Pan's Labyrinth, she has more power over anyone. Also, with regard to disobedience, it is seen as an extremely helpful but hard thing to do in Pan's Labyrinth. It goes along with the idea that the hardest things to do can often hold the most power. The disobedience of Ophelia's beliefs in magic caused verbal and physical abuse, yet she did it because she knew she was saving her mother and herself. Her disobedience was looked down upon by the authority figures in her life and maybe even by the audience at times, but it ended up saving her mother's life at one point and her brother's life. There is a very negative connotation when it comes to disobedience. Children are taught to follow rules right when they are born. Pan's Labyrinth says this differently. Think of the parallel to the fascist rebellion that Mercedes is a part of. She's in clear disobedience for what she believes in. However, her disobedience ends up causing the captain's death. This creates a positive connotation with doing something wrong when you know it will have the right outcome. In other words, doing the wrong thing for the right reason. These two themes point towards her coming of age as mentioned earlier. Ophelia's innocence is huge throughout this movie. The way she comes of age shows the loss of her inherent childlike innocence and represents womanhood in a social context. To begin, the faun gives Ophelia a book and it bleeds in the shape of the female reproductive system, showing her growing into her adolescence with regard to her upcoming menstruation. Also, when Ophelia goes into the tree that holds the toad, the tree appears to look like the female reproductive system. She leaves the cute dress her mother gave her behind, signifying the losing of her virtuousness. As we see, the toad puts up a fight and can give social context to the idea of womanhood in this movie. The toad is blocking her road to womanhood, and when she defeats the toad, it can represent her breaking through the barriers to female liberation, once again showing Del Toro's statement of using children's inherent qualities in this film to show the coming of age. Jennifer Orme also states that Pan's Labyrinth also questions the presumed political innocence of the fairy tale in its use of a child as the central figure whose violent and terrifying adventures echo mid-20th century horrors. This brings in the historical context spoken about earlier, as the innocence and hopefulness of a child comes full circle to introduce the coming-of-age theme in this movie, as we finish off with Ophelia finishing her tale with, "And every day the rose wilted, unable to bequeath its gift unto anyone." This shows how once that innocence is lost, the child has come of age. There is no gift of hope to share with the rest of the world, no disobedience, just a child who is now grown up. In Persepolis, disobedience can hold very drastic consequences. In the scene after Margie tells her teacher off, her mother worriedly yells at her about what Iran does to girls that rebel. Take a look.
Eh oui, elle tient ça de son oncle, cette petite.
Mais qu'est-ce que tu racontes? Tu veux qu'elle finisse comme son oncle? Exécutée? Tu sais ce qu'ils font aux jeunes filles quand ils les arrêtent? Tu sais ce qui est arrivé à Niloufar? Tu sais ce qu'ils lui ont fait? Tu sais que selon la loi, on n'a pas le droit de tuer une vierge. Alors...
After being told multiple times to stop rebelling, Margie sees what her disobedience does to others, especially her mother, and that although it might be the right thing to do, it is not done without consequence. We can see this as a little bit different than Pan's Labyrinth, as there isn't a good result of Margie's actions, even though we know she's doing the right thing, and that we would prefer her to get the justice she wants. On the hope spectrum, Kimberly Siegel speaks about how Satrapi in the movie has the memoir show Marjan as a little girl enraptured by her uncle's tales of political resistance. Satrapi uses Margie's hope and childlike wonder for storytelling to show how young she is. Margie is also seen as a symbol of hope for the future, as her family sends her to study abroad in a French school in Vienna. They believe she is the representation of hope in the family, as they not only want her to get away from Iran to prevent her harm, but also they want her to have a beautiful future outside of their dangerous country. Furthermore, to do with loss of innocence and coming of age, Margie grows up in a war setting where death is very prominent, as she loses her uncle Anoush that she looked up to in the stories that he told her about his bravery. Kimberly Siegel speaks about how Satrapi uses the humorous sketchings, religion through a child's eyes, are nonetheless important choices for inclusion within this historical depiction of Iran. Satrapi wanted to use these comic book sketchings to show the innocence of how young she was when this all occurred, to show her childlike qualities in the beginning and how she came of age since then due to her experiences. Relating to puberty part of coming of age, Margie is forced to wear a veil to show her subserviency, and becoming a woman that has to face the ugliness of the country around her. She is told that soldiers will rape her in order to not kill a virgin, also taking away from her childhood. She paints her nails in hopes of rebelling and doesn't want to wear her veil correctly because it is forced on her. We have once again these two themes segueing to the overall theme of the movie, coming of age. Again, the use of Margie as a child representing all of these themes is because children see the world through a different lens. And furthermore, after the journey Margie goes through, it is not only a changed sense of self and a changed way of relating to others, but a changed worldview. By both of these scenes using Margie and Ophelia to represent the good and bad of disobedience, the belief in magic and innocence of hope to show their coming-of-age stories, we see how children can shift the entire dynamic and create multiple themes within any film given different social contexts.